The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
Happy Free Agent Day, everyone. Welcome to Fantasy NBA Today, the first of what I'm referring to affectionately as Micropod Monday. I've never done this before, but my thought is that because news comes in these chunks, there are a couple of ways we could attack it. Way number one, which is the way I've generally done this in the past, is to try to talk about everything all in one podcast. And unfortunately, inevitably, with that method, something gets left out, or the podcast gets ridiculously long, or a combination of both. Sometimes there's too much. The third, I guess, thing that could happen in that scenario is that you don't do a podcast that's like 85 to 100 minutes, and instead you end up stretching things over a few days, and then it's just not that up to date anymore. You're doing a show about something that happened a day and a half ago, and at free agency, that's too long. So, in my infinite wisdom, I decided to try the micropod. The micropod. Meaning, I'm going to do probably a few shows about free agency, and when they come out is entirely up to me. I'm going to do one now, which is about 3:30 Pacific time. As I'm recording it, we're half an hour into free agency, and I'll probably do another one later on today, if I had to guess. So, without further ado, welcome to the show. I am your host, Dan Bespris. I hope some of you are finding this for the first time. That would be awesome, and if that's the case, then I'll definitely do more of these micropods on big days in the future. This is Fantasy NBA Today, a hoop ball presentation, hoop-ball.com, the website at Dan Bespris, on Twitter, DanBesbris, at Hoopball Fantasy on Twitter if you want to follow the various hoopball-y things, all the fantasy stuff. In fact, all of these deals as they're going down are getting tweeted out of the Hoopball Fantasy bucket as well. So that's a nice way to sort of keep tabs on everything that's going on. If you enjoy these micropods, please take a moment to drop a 5-star review on the podcast. Subscribe to it. This is we'll be talking fantasy basketball every day, all year long, all season long. We go off season, in season, whatever. Many of you, of course, have listened to this podcast for a very long time, but hopefully this is a cool way to bring in a handful of new listeners. Again, that is Dan Bespris on Twitter. Let's rock. Free agency opened, again, about 35-ish minutes ago, and the big piece of news that fell out of the sky basically the moment free agency cracked is that Lonzo Ball agreed to a 4-year deal with the Chicago Bulls as part of a sign-and-trade that sent Garrett Temple and Tomas Satoransky back to the New Orleans Pelicans, which is not a I mean, and I think a second-round pick. So effectively, the Pels got a second-round pick. And I don't mean to knock Satoransky, because we've actually been sort of on that train on the fantasy side a few times in the past. When he gets nice full starters minutes, he can be a relatively useful 9-cat guy. But he's not a building block for the Pels. It's not even in the vicinity. And then Garrett Temple isn't a building block for the Pels. So they really didn't get, like, you think about sign-in trades in recent memory, you often are looking for the team getting something back to be, yeah, you might get some contracts. Maybe you don't want those because you got to match with the player that you signed and then sent away. But there's usually some sort of pick incentive, and a second rounder is basically what you're getting for Lonzo Ball at this point. That's pretty awful. That's nothing. Deep breath, Pels fans. I hopefully something will break your way here in the not too distant future. I do like that you guys got Jonas Valanciunas. I think you generally won that trade out. But this one, we knew Lonzo Ball wanted out. The Pels were just trying to get something. And you have to, if you're a Pels fan, you have to look at it from that perspective. You got something. From a fantasy standpoint, this is actually a pretty cool trade on a number of fronts. We'll go back, and we've already covered the Pelicans in one of our team breakdowns this offseason. We handicapped them on the notion that Lonzo would be back, even though we kind of knew that he probably wasn't going to be. But what this does in New Orleans is you bring in two guys that are not key pieces of the future, and you clear out room for guys that are. So JV is going to be in the middle. Brandon Ingram, Zion, that's your front court. The front court is locked in. Everything is cool over there. The back court was where things were a little bit, I don't want to say up in the air, but the two starting backcourt guys on this team for this entire just completed season are gone now. Because Eric Bledsoe went to Memphis, and he's probably going to get bought out over there. And Lonzo Ball now went to Chicago. And what I said many times during this most recent season on the fantasy side is that if you wanted Nickeil Alexander-Walker or Kira Lewis, but I think most notably Nah, we'll just call him Nah, because, Nollins, Alexander Walker, if you wanted him to step into fantasy value, he needed 2 or even 3 guys to get out of his way. And he may end up having 4 guys stepping out of his way. I could argue that last season, J.J. Redick, Josh Hart, Lonzo Ball, and Eric Bledsoe were all in front of Nickeil Alexander-Walker in the team's guard pecking order. And there's a little bit of fuzziness to that. Like, maybe you could argue that he was sort of on par with Redick or Hart, and then Redick got traded. And maybe he was on par with Hart as the season went along. But now, I don't know how you argue that he's behind any of the guards on this team. Satoransky should be behind him for a young team sort of growing together. You'll see Sato play. He's going to be a veteran calming presence. And I don't know how you say he's behind Garrett Temple, who just came in. In fact, you could probably make a reasonable argument that the only guy who might move in front of Nickeil Alexander-Walker in the guard pecking order on this team is Kira Lewis, who was already there. So this then brings us to the other part of this equation. Part number 1 is, does someone now have a massive opportunity? The answer to that question is a resounding yes. The second part is does the fantasy game translate in a way that makes enough sense? And the answer to that question is a little bit less clear because you're going to see starters minutes out of Nickeil Alexander-Walker. But last year, in 22 minutes a game, he averaged 11 points, 3 boards, 2 assists, 1.7 threes, and a steal on 42% from the field and 73% at the free throw line. That's a problem. In points leagues, he's geared up to be a massive winner, because you don't care about those two things. In category leagues, it's a little bit less obvious because even now, moving Lonzo out of the way, moving Eric Bledsoe out of the way, moving Josh Hart, who I guess there's a chance that he could be back, he's a free agent, out of the way. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity that just surfaced because Ball played 32 minutes a game this year, Hart 29 minutes a game this last year, Bledsoe 30. They basically cleared out 30 minutes of backcourt stuff and brought in only Sato and Garrett Temple. 90. Brought in only 2 guys to take them. And those 2 guys are not taking starters minutes anyway. So the minutes are going to be there. That's not a question mark. The question mark is, what does it look like with Alexander Walker as a starter not getting a boatload of shots? Certainly a lot more. Is there a stretches this last year where he jumped into a driver's seat? Like, remember the game in, I think it was Golden State? Wasn't it a Golden State game where Alexander Walker had like 40? Where the hell is that one? Or was it the Clippers? It was the Clippers. It was in California. That's as far as I got on that one. It was the Clippers. He had 37 points and 8 rebounds and really not much else, unfortunately, in that ball game. But I think it was also worth noting who had to be gone for that to take place for him. Ingram was in, Hart was in, Redick was in, Zion, Lonzo, Bledsoe were all out in that ball game. there is a finite number of shot attempts that a team's going to get in a ball game, and it's pretty safe to say Brandon Ingram is still going to get his 17 or 18, and Zion's still going to get his 17 or 18. Lonzo, 13 out. Hart, 7 out. Bledsoe, 10 out. That's what did I just give you? About 30 shots on the way out. Walker took 10. Alexander Walker, sorry. Took 10 shots a game this last year. Of the 30 shots that just went away for this team, Steven Adams, 5 out, but JV's going to take probably a dozen. So call it more like a net 23 instead of 30 or something like that, maybe even a little bit less. There's going to be a lot of spreading around that goes on here. Kira Lewis is going to get some. Najee Marshall's going to get some. Ingram and Zion are probably going to get more. JV's going to get a decent chunk of shots on this team. Alexander Walker, what are we thinking? 14? Is that enough based on his current efficiency level? Will the assists go up enough? Will the three-pointers go up enough? I don't think that in a 9-cat situation, this is as easy a guarantee as I'm betting a lot of fantasy analysts are going to tell you. Make no mistake, this is a very good day for Nickeil Alexander-Walker's overall outlook because he's probably going to play 7 or 8 minutes more per game this coming year than last season. I would also hope that in year number 3, his field goal and free throw percent both go up. I don't know if that's going to happen. I certainly hope on the free throw side, 73% is not where this dude's going to stick. So that removes one of the pretty good-sized negatives for him, although he didn't take that many anyway. But he will. He'll have more this next season. I would also hope that the steals stay strong for him. Lonzo had about 1.5 per game. Alexander Walker, you get him up to Lonzo-level minutes. Maybe he, too, can get near 1.5 per ball game. But there are a lot of things about his game that worry me. He doesn't rebound. He doesn't assist all that well. And again, Ingram and Zion are going to be the guys that orchestrate for the most part. Kira Lewis, if he's out there, is more the point guard, and Alexander Walker is more the shooting guard in that group. And I've talked a lot on these pods about how hard it is to be a shooting guard that translate into top-level fantasy value if you're not the primary ball handler. If you're the primary ball handler, you throw it all out the window. You're not even really a shooting guard anymore. You're a glorified scoring point guard. But if you look at most of the mid-tier shooting guards in the NBA, they struggle to hold fantasy value. There needs to be something special about them. Big-time free throw percent, big-time three-pointers, something to get them over the hump. Otherwise, you end up in this massive 90 to 150 rank bucket of shooting guards that can't clear the threshold. Kevin Huerter is the premier example of a shooting guard who is okay at a lot of things but isn't the primary ball handler, so can't quite get over that hump. Nickeil Alexander-Walker could very easily turn into Kevin Huerter this coming year with worse field goal percent, higher turnovers, worse free throw percent, and better scoring and steals, maybe? But Huerter was 115. So how different do we think Alexander Walker becomes? If he can get his percentages up to Huerter level, which is 43 from the field, 78 at the free throw line, I think he'll have enough usage on that team to be better than Huerter was on a per-game basis, which again was 115. And I know I'm going deep into the weeds on this one, but a lot of you guys are going to be targeting Nickeil Alexander-Walker on draft day, and I find it hard to see him getting above top 80 on a per-game basis. I don't see a clear path to it unless he's suddenly racking up assists in a way that he hasn't in the time he's had on the floor so far in his young career. And that can change, because no Lonzo, no Bledsoe means he's going to have to do some passing, but Ingram and Zion are still going to be the primary initiators on that team, and then even JV a little bit. On the other side, this is a trade that sends Lonzo Ball to Chicago, where he's actually not in that dissimilar of a role to what he had in New Orleans. Lonzo, by all accounts, actually had a pretty good year from a strict per-game standpoint. He was number 48 on the year, 15 points, 5 boards, 6 assists, 1.5 steals, half a block, 3 3-pointers, fixed his free throw percent up to palatable levels, got his field goal percent up to slightly sub-palatable levels, but you can handle them because of all the other stuff he was doing, as the third option on a middling team. He goes to another club where he's now the third option on a middling team. Behind Zach LaVine, behind Nikola Vucevic, two guys that are going to see similar usage to Ingram and Zion, maybe even a tiny bit higher. But Lonzo's role is pretty well locked in. The Bulls' other stuff going on, I don't think challenges him all that much for role, for playing time, whatever. And so, I think you're looking at Lonzo where you're making roughly the same handicap, probably about a dozen shots per ball game. And you can do the comparison on this one if you'd like. It's not all that insane to look at it. Vooch took 20 shots a game this year, although a lot of that was with Orlando, and then some in Chicago with LaVine out, and Zach looked 19 and change. Those numbers probably come down a little bit. Kobe White basically gets replaced. I don't know that he sees much playing time this coming year at all. Lauri Markkanen, Thad Young, one of those two guys will probably be a part of the front court next to Vooch. I'm guessing it'll be Thad. Daniel Theis signed elsewhere, so that moves, at least for the moment now, Markkanen back into a more primary backup big man role. And then Patrick Williams is your other wing on that team. So, these are not... Thad isn't a high-usage guy. Williams isn't a high-usage guy. In fact, really low usage this year. And then I'm sure they'll just fill in the periphery here with someone else who isn't a particularly high-usage dude. So... take Kobe White's 13 shots and carve those up in a big way. Sato took 6. Temple took 7. Those are on the way out. I don't see Lonzo Ball running into much resistance and getting pretty close to this most recent year's fantasy numbers. Probably a small hit, if only because Vooch and LaVine are even a little bit more ball dominant than Ingram and Zion Williamson. So maybe an ever so slight step back. You might also suggest that Lonzo plays more than this last year. He was in the 75-ish% range of his team's games played, and that's not going to be enough. That's going to put him below his per-game marker on the totals side. So I think the trade is fine for Lonzo. I don't think it changes the outlook all that much. Ever so slight arrow down, and you're going to be handicapping him based on how healthy you think he can stay this year, which, from a roto standpoint, he's... safe-ish. He's got a lot of name power. I'm guessing he's probably not going to be a great draft day value this year. And from a total standpoint, I can almost guarantee he's not going to be a draft day value because he can't stay healthy, and he never has. Maybe he turns that around. Again, we base all of our assessments on what we've seen so far. But what we've seen so far from him in his young career is that he doesn't make it through a season in one piece. I'd be far more inclined to... I'm going to watch both, so this is sort of a stupid sentence to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you told me I couldn't guess what the ADPs were going to be for Lonzo Ball or Nickeil Alexander-Walker, I would say there's a higher likelihood that Alexander Walker beats his ADP by totals than Lonzo beating his by totals. On a per-game basis, I actually think it might be the other way around. I think there's a very real chance that neither one of them beats their ADP on a per-game basis because Ball has a lot of name power, and Alexander Walker is going to be a huge buzz guy. You're going to see every analyst on the planet talking about what a huge jump he's going to get this year, and he will, but it's going to push him too far. I want to draft him near 100, and I don't think he's fallen that far. Frankly, I'd like to draft him near 115, and I'm certain he's not falling that far. Ah, yes, the beauty of the micropod. That was one trade. I've fallen far behind now. I'm doing a show while more news is breaking. Oh, well, I'll catch up at some point. The next thing that came through the pike, or came down the pike, is that Will Barton got signed to a 2-year, $16 million deal, which is a bit of a head-scratcher, I'll admit. But with where the Nuggets are coming from, they were in a little bit of a bind. They're not going to have Jamal Murray until at least the middle of next year, and he won't be fully healthy until basically the end of the season. Jokic, they've already talked about how they want to give him some scheduled rest days. Michael Porter Jr. is going to be playing a colossal role on this team, but behind Jokic and Michael Porter Jr., they don't have the other guy to trust anymore. If you go back a couple of seasons, Malik Beasley maybe could have grown into that scoring role, but now you're talking about Facundo Campazzo, who's very much a pass-first point guard, Monte Morris, who's very much the epitome of conservative guard in that he makes very few mistakes, but he takes very few chances. He's pretty efficient, but he's not going to lead the charge in any way. They needed someone else that could sort of catch fire on a game-to-game basis. And I guess that's sort of Aaron Gordon, but he's also a wildly inefficient basketball player. So they just felt, I think, like they needed to have Barton back. And he's coming off a pretty clunky fantasy season, which is a shame because I actually had him as one of our really late Dan Besbris Old Man Squad guys. I thought he would exceed expectations. He did not. 42.5% from the field, 78.5% at the free throw line, 13 points, 4 boards, 3 assists. He had these stretches where he caught when lava hot, and then he had other stretches where he was completely useless. But in a scenario now where there's no Jamal Murray for, I guess most of the season, you have to assume that Barton's going to, if healthy, that's the big if here, have a pretty decent size role on the team. For me, it comes back to whether or not he can actually get to an efficiency standpoint that makes any sense from a fantasy standpoint. So I know I'm repeating myself a little bit here because this is the magic of the micropod. This is sort of instant reaction stuff and not taking the time to do all of the notes on paper first. Barton has it in him. Last year, before the shutdown, he was at 15, 5, and 6. He was good on 45% shooting from the field. This year, 13, 4, and 3 on, he played 31 minutes this year to 33 last season, but a lot of stuff was down. 42.5% from the field. Again, the rebounding, the assists, those were both down year over year. The steals were ever so slightly down. But again, if you go back now 4 years when he was mostly healthy and coming off the bench as sort of a gunner, 12.5 shots per game. This last year, 11. It really does feel like with Barton, you're about 1.5 to 2 shots per game away from him hitting fantasy value. And it feels attainable with no Jamal Murray. I don't think he's going to go very early in fantasy drafts this year. I'd be pretty surprised because he was bad this last season. He wasn't good. He showed flashes, particularly in mid-April when Jamal Murray was down and before Barton got hurt. Remember, he got hurt near the end of April and didn't really play until the end of the Nuggets playoff run when they were getting beat up by the Suns. But prior to going down, and this is actually really important handicapping as we glance towards the future again, you need to look at basically like the month of April for Will Barton, or call it like mid-March to when he got hurt in mid-April. His fantasy numbers didn't fluctuate that much from a rank standpoint, but you could see the outlines of it. His shots went up a little bit. His free throw percent was actually up a little bit over that stretch. He was at 14 points, 2 3-pointers, 3.6 boards, 3.7 assists, and 1 steal. And he was really like 1 shot a game away from being in that mix. By the way, it's also worth noting that I think Jamal Murray got hurt like a week after that. It's fair to say he still wasn't completely there. But when did Jamal Murray get hurt? Like April 10th or something around there? Over the next 2 weeks? I mean, there really were only like 2 weeks where Barton was healthy and Jamal Murray was out. It's a weird game of tag we're playing here. But during that stretch from like April 1st to April 15th or so, you saw him take 14, 11, 16, 13, 11, 11, and then there were these weird games where he took 6 and 8 shots. I don't actually fully know what happened in those ball games because they were somewhat competitive. 10, 19, and then 13 shots before going down. So he was a lot closer. Basically, April 1. I mean, there was a stretch even in March where he was taking a bunch of shots, and Jamal Murray was actually in. He's just so inconsistent. And so if you're talking about a roto play, he's not my favorite. If you're talking about a head-to-head play, there's a little bit of something there, but he would have to stay healthy, and that hasn't really been his thing lately either. 56 games this year, 58 last year, 43 the year before that. I'd like to say that there's a fantasy reason to take a chance on Will Barton, but I just don't think there is. I don't see a path for him to get inside the top 100 unless his shots per game go up by about 2 per, and I don't think they get there with Aaron Gordon around. If you could take one more guy out of the equation on this team, there's a possibility of it. But there's still Jokic, there's still Michael Porter Jr., there's still Aaron Gordon. I know for the Nuggets, they're thinking this is a guy we need as someone who's been here for a while. He can shore up a particular position on the floor. But from a fantasy standpoint, I don't think it's going to get there. So I'm just not all that interested. The next one that went down, or at least this is the way that I was retweeting them as they happened, is that the Rockets signed Daniel Theis to a multi-year deal. And this is actually kind of interesting because the Rockets are super-duper young, and they brought in a guy who's still relatively young. I know it's like we've been following Theis for a while from the fantasy standpoint. He's 29. He came over to the NBA when he already had a few years under his belt. I think this was his 4th season in the NBA. So he was already like 25 when he came over, or when he made his NBA debut. So he's not a young guy. He's sort of NBA young in that he hasn't been in the league for a super-duper long time. But he steps into a pretty intriguing spot in Houston because we saw what happened to Kelly Olynyk when he stepped into Houston last year. Now, there's other stuff going on here. Olynyk got a chance to play a ton because Christian Wood was being rested a boatload, but they also logged some minutes together, those two guys. That's that's worth pointing out because there's a chance that type of thing could happen again. Like, for instance, look at a game towards the end of April. Rockets and Bucks. Rockets beat them, actually, 143-136 in a ridiculous basketball game. That I don't even know how this one happened in real time. But Olynyk and Wood played side by side for about 30 minutes of that ball game. They were actually starters together. Olynyk at the 5, Wood at the 4, kind of interchangeable. That was the Kevin Porter 50-point game, by the way. Porter, Jayshawn Tate, Armani Brooks were the other guys that got the start. Yeah, the Rockets could opt to use Theis exclusively as a backup 5 behind Christian Wood, but I don't know that for the Rockets there's a super obvious lineup. Even if you take Theis off the floor and move Wood to the 5, how obvious is the starting 5 on this team? Wood's the 5. Who's the 4? Kenyon Martin Jr.? Okay. Who's the 3? Jayshawn Tate? All right. I can get behind that. The 2? Kevin Porter Jr., John Wall, starting point guard, Eric Gordon, your backup guard of note, I guess. Daniel House is floating around in there on the wing. But there's really only, I would argue, one big man, and it's Christian Wood. Kenyon Martin Jr. can play power forward. Jayshawn Tate can play power forward, but I don't know that that's necessarily their best spot on the floor. And all that is to say, there are going to be some minutes for Daniel Theis, who you guys know, particularly from a roto standpoint, because he's not going to blow the roof off the building. I like Daniel Theis' fantasy game a lot. He finished up the year in Chicago. Theis top 160 in about 25 minutes per ball game. But, of course, some of that you have to tag onto the note that for some reason his defensive stats just weren't there at all this season. I can't really isolate what happened there because in Boston, for 42 games, he was averaging 1.6 combined defensive stats in 24 minutes per game, and he went to Chicago and averaged 1.3 in 25 minutes per game. What do we get out of Theis if he actually gets more playing time than that? What if he gets into the 27-28 range? Does the defensive stat... I mean, are you talking about a guy now that's going to be at like 1.8 combined defensive stats or 1.5, 1.6? That's actually a pretty big deal. On this young team that's just playing fast and loose, does he see more than 7 and change shots per game? Does that get up to 8.5? These are all things. Does he rebound better than 6? Can he get to 6.5 or 7? He has a pretty easy path to fantasy value if his usage and his playing time just see the smallest bump. He's very close because he's not a bad foul shooter, 73% in his career for a big man. Not horrible, not great. 55% from the field, adds about a half to a 1, somewhere in the middle, 3/4 of a three-pointer per ball game, and he's been getting better there. He's not going to just step into Kelly Olynyk's role. It's not going to be quite so 1-to-1, but I actually think Daniel Theis is, at least through this first now, like 50 minutes of free agency. More than that, I guess it's been an hour. He's actually a sort of a sneaky winner. Everybody, myself included, was wondering where Kelly Olynyk was going to end up. What we forgot to wonder was who was going to take his place. I thought the answer was nobody. I thought they'd bring in some, young guy to get a shot behind Wood or a veteran's minimum just to lead from the locker room standpoint. But they brought in a player who is still looking to make some money, get some playing time. That's a really interesting deal. I don't fully understand it, I'll admit it, because Rockets are playing in full rebuild mode right now, and also the note that it's a multi-year deal most likely. This is interesting. This is very interesting. And that's where we're actually going to pause after this one. I'm just going to do the first 3. It's a half-an-hour show. We'll probably do another one later on today with another few moves, and we'll just keep this up until we're all done. This is Fantasy NBA Today. Please spread the word. This is how we're doing it right now. We got a lot to cover. I'm Dan Vespris. This is a Hoop Ball presentation. I'll talk to you on the next Micropod. Later, everybody.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.
There are so many reasons not to skip breakfast. So many savory, mouth-watering, tasty, delicious beyond all belief reasons. Actually, that last one was pretty convincing. Stop by for a McDonald's breakfast. Mix and match a sausage biscuit, sausage McMuffin, sausage burrito, or hash browns, any 2 for just $2. Price and participation may vary, cannot be combined with combo meal.